Welcome to today's tutorial in using brush tracking in Corel Painter 12. It is of course possible to work in Corel Painter 12 using a mouse, just as with any other program. But if you want to take full advantage of Painter's natural media brushes and paint in the most natural and intuitive way possible, it is highly recommended that you use Corel Painter together with a graphics tablet. The movements you can make with a mouse are limited, generally very linear and angular, making it almost impossible to paint sweeping strokes or add fine details with any degree of accuracy. Using the stylus of a graphics tablet, on the other hand, such as the Wacom Intuos 5 tablet I'm using here for example, allows you to produce realistic brushstrokes that, for example, fade in and out. And just as with painting with real brushes and pens, a stylus will allow you to change the width, tilt, angle and pressure of the stroke as you are going along. Before we actually start to set up our brush tracking in Corel Painter 12, let's take a look at how a graphics tablet stylus actually works. The stylus-based interface of a graphics tablet has the ability to detect some or all of pressure, tilt, rotation and other attributes of the stylus and its interaction with the tablet. Many software graphics packages, such as Painter, are able to make use of the input information generated by a tablet to modify the brush size, shape, opacity and colour, etc. Also, if you are using photo editing software, and Corel Painter 12 works very well in conjunction with Adobe Photoshop for example, you will find that here too, working with a tablet makes life so much easier. The Corel Painter airbrushes, for example, also respond to the finger wheel of the Wacom Intuos airbrush and simulate the needle control that adjusts just how much ink is sprayed out onto the canvas. So basically the stylus is going to replace your brushes, pencils, chalks and any other media that you might be using in an actual artist studio. Every artist uses a different pressure when drawing on an Intuos tablet. The Corel Painter brush tracking preferences help you to customize your Intuos tablet to meet your particular pressure sensitivity needs. When you draw with traditional media, the amount of pressure you use with a tool determines how dense and how wide your strokes will be. And using a pressure-sensitive Wacom pen or stylus with Corel Painter gives you the same kind of control. Because each artist has a different strength or pressure level in a stroke, setting up your brush tracking will allow you to adjust Corel Painter to match your stroke strength, something which is particularly useful for artists with a lighter touch. If a light stroke leaves no colour on the canvas, you can go back to use brush tracking to increase the stylus sensitivity. And finally, very important to remember, is that you can tie stylus input data, such as velocity, direction, pressure, wheel, tilt and bearing, etc., to specific brush features, such as opacity, grain, angle, size, jitter, resaturation, bleed, flow and depth. As we will see later on in this video, you can control and customize these settings in the expression areas of the brush creator. Corel Painter produces realistic brushstrokes that fade in and out or change width, tilt, angle with the stylus input. Some brush variants, such as fine spray and other airbrushes, as well as pencil variants, are particularly sensitive to stylus tilt, or how close to the vertical the stylus is held, and also to bearing, which is the compass direction in which the stylus is pointing. Imagine, if you will, that in this example I am using one of Painter's pencil variants. On the left, if I hold my pencil in the vertical, I will be producing a thin, well-defined stroke because I'm basically drawing with the pencil point. On the right, as I tilt the stylus downwards towards the page, I'm effectively shading in with the side of the pencil, producing a much broader and softer stroke. Depending on the stylus you are using, and there are normally several types to choose from, your stylus may also support rotation in 360 degrees. Rotating the stylus will then have a similar effect to twisting a brush between your thumb and forefinger. This works particularly well with brush variants that have a lot of bristle features, for example, such as the oil brushes. It also works very well with the calligraphy pens. As you can see in the example on the right, twisting or rotating the brush will drag the bristles round in a circular movement. Finally, let's take a look at bearing. Bearing refers to the direction the stylus is pointing in. If I use an airbrush variant, for example, holding the stylus or airbrush vertically will spray down directly on the canvas, as we can see on the left. But as I tilt the stylus and change the bearing, as we can see here on the right, the paint will spray out in that direction, allowing you to do some fantastic graffiti type artwork. Let's now move back to Painter and talk some more about working with the stylus versus the mouse. Using a stylus and tablet will help you to create smooth curves, gradual transition and precise brush strokes. But in order to take full advantage of the pressure, tilt and bearing input, we first need to set up the stylus to reflect our own personal input. Every artist uses different pressure when drawing on a tablet, and the Corel Painter brush tracking preferences are going to help you to customize your Intuos tablet to meet your own individual pressure sensitivity needs. When you draw with traditional media, let's say a pencil for example, the amount of force or pressure that I use and the angle I hold my pencil at are all going to influence the width and colour intensity of my stroke. And using a pressure sensitive stylus will give us that same level of control. In addition, the pressure used when using different media, for example hard pencils or soft chalks, can mean that you as an artist will be using different pressures in different situations. You can adjust Corel Painter 12 to match your stroke strength for all brushes using the brush tracking preferences. In today's tutorial, we'll be looking at both methods. To set up the general brush tracking, we can use either the brush tracking command from the welcome screen, or we can access this at any time by using the Painter Preferences panel. In Windows, this is under Edit, Preferences, Brush Tracking, or if you're using a Mac, this will be under the menu Corel Painter 12, Preferences, Brush Tracking. Or of course under the Help menu, you can access the welcome screen, and from here you can access brush tracking. The default brush tracking settings that you create now are saved by Painter so that those settings will still be there the next time you open Painter up or until you recalibrate them. When we open up the brush tracking panel, the first thing we notice is the so-called scratch pad. The most common way to set the brush pressure sensitivity is to apply a typical brush stroke, for example one like this or perhaps a wavy line, applying what would be for you normal pressure. Corel Painter then uses your stroke to calculate the appropriate pressure and velocity settings for all brush variants. As we draw on the scratch pad, we can see these slider bars here for velocity scale, velocity power, pressure scale and pressure power changing dynamically. Here Corel Painter has calculated these settings for us, but we can still manually adjust them from here. And if I'm happy with the settings and I don't want to make any more adjustments, I can just click on OK. I'm I'm just going to close this down because I already have a canvas open. Now let's go back to the scratchboard tool. I start off by using a very light pressure and gradually increasing the pressure. So I've gone from a very fine thin line to quite a heavy wide line. If I now go back into the brush tracking settings, I can manually adjust the pressure scale and pressure power even further to use the widest range possible of pressure sensitivity. Now when I use the scratch tool, I get a much finer transition from the fine part of the line to the end of the line, so it's going much more smoothly from very fine to quite wide. And of course you could also go back into the brush tracking and adjust your velocity scale and velocity power so that when you're drawing with different speeds, that again your brush stroke reflects this. We've spoken about setting up our graphics tablet stylus using the brush tracking panel, which Painter is going to use as the basis for calculating what it thinks are the appropriate pressure and velocity settings for a brush variant. But what if you would like to use less pressure when using, say, a sketching pencil, or use more pressure when using an oil paint brush variant? If we now set up brush calibration for specific brushes, in addition to the general brush tracking preferences, we can really fine-tune the responsiveness of the stylus. To calibrate a specific brush, first select the brush variant you want to apply this to, and here I'm using an Artist's Impressionist brush, and then go to Window, Brush Control Panels, and Brush Calibration, or simply use the keyboard shortcut Control B. Again, as with brush tracking, Corel Painter will save the brush calibration control settings with that particular brush variant, so that next time I choose the Impressionist brush, it will have remembered my settings. The first thing we need to do is to enable the brush calibration by checking this box. You might have noticed that we have here the same 4 adjustment sliders as we had in the brush tracker, but the values here differ from the general settings. This is because Painter has already made some adjustments based on our brush tracking and which it thinks are the appropriate settings for this brush. We can of course adjust these manually, but in this case I'm going to use the brush calibration option here. Let's first take a look at how the Impressionist brush is painting at the moment. We are now going to make some adjustments here, and here I'm painting from very fine, using a little pressure, to painting quite dense strokes using more pressure. Let's now go to the brush tracking options. As with the previous brush tracking session that we have just seen, applying changes here are going to set the pressure levels for this particular Impressionist brush. And now I can paint using the whole range of pressure, from very faint strokes to quite heavy and dense strokes. Before continuing with brush calibration, I'm just going to clear the canvas by selecting everything with Control A and then hitting the backspace key. As we mentioned earlier, Corel Painter lets you control brush effects along a stroke based on a number of real-time stylus input factors. What this means is that specific brush features, such as opacity, grain, angle, size, jitter, resaturation, bleed, flow and depth, can be mapped to stylus input data, such as velocity, direction, pressure, tilt, bearing, and if you have an intuos wheel airbrush, you can also apply the wheel settings. We're now going to take a look at the expressions sliders. The expression settings are going to allow us to link tablet stylus input with specific brush features. So how do we go about mapping stylus input to brush behaviour? Well, we're sticking with the brush control panel here, and we're now going to be using a new feature called expression. And we'll find the behaviours, the input behaviours, within this drop-down list. When you first open up the brush control panel, you might find all the various setting tabs a bit overwhelming, and unfortunately in this short tutorial we don't have time to cover all bases with regards to the brush control settings. But in the Painter 12 user guide, which you can access under the help menu, you'll find in-depth information on adjusting all of these settings here. This includes information on the results that you'll get using different expression modes. So which brush properties are the expression settings linked to? On the General tab under Expression, we're going to find the various stylus input parameters. Here we have opacity and grain. And if we go over to size, we can change the size of the brush according to how much pressure we use, what speed or velocity we use, which direction we move the stylus in. So let's just give this a try. At the moment, my Impressionist brush is set to a size of 19. I'm going to increase the size to about 80, and let's see what happens when I start painting with increasing pressure along the stroke. At the start of the stroke, where I used very light pressure, the brush stroke remains quite small, but as I increase the pressure, the dab size gets larger and larger. I could also have the dab size change with the velocity of the stylus. So when I move at a nice steady pace, the brush stays more or less the same size. But if I speed it up, we can see that at the beginning of the stroke, where the velocity was at its greatest, the dabs here are a lot larger than the final dabs. So I'm just moving my stylus here at a constant speed to demonstrate that the velocity is affecting the dab size. So let's just clear the canvas and try this one more time. So once with constant speed, dabs are more or less the same size, and once with increasing speed, larger dabs at the front with increased velocity, trailing off to smaller dabs at the end. So what other stylus input options do we have here? Direction. I've never actually tried direction before, so let's give this a go. So I'm just going to start painting in various different directions here to see what effect this has. And you might notice that the diagonal strokes are narrower and smaller in dab size than the horizontal strokes, even though in both cases I'm using exactly the same stylus pressure. Let's just take a final look at some other tabs that also have expression settings. For example, the jitter tab. At the moment there is no jitter setting applied here, but if we just move the brush slowly or move it quite fast, there's no difference at all between the stroke. If however we change the jitter expression to velocity, and again I make quite a fast stroke, the dabs are actually placed almost on top of each other. Another tab that also has expression settings is the Impasto tab. And again we have various settings here. This is greyed out at the moment because I don't have an Impasto brush chosen at the moment. Now one thing we need to be aware of here is that when we make changes to the settings, we are actually making changes to our default brush variants. If you do make any changes using the expression options or through brush calibration or any of the other brush settings here, if you like the changes and want to keep them, but you don't want to lose your original brush, then just go up to the Brushes menu and click on Save Variant. We can now give our new variant a name, and I'm just going to call this Impressionist New, and click on OK. This new brush can now be found in our Artists category in the list of brush variants. But if, as it sometimes happens, you've made changes that you don't like particularly and you want to return to your original brush variant, you can either click on the Reset tool, which will reset your brush back to its original settings, or you can also go up to Brushes and click on Restore Default Variant. You can also click on Restore All Default Variants, but by doing that you'll be losing your customization. Well, we hope you've enjoyed our short tutorial on using brush tracking and brush configuration. Thank you for watching.